The Substance is one of the best movies I've seen in years. The story follows an aging actress who is attempting to preserve her fame and beauty by taking an experimental drug that splits her consciousness between herself and another body. Both versions of the actress need to keep switching places, and the younger body needs the older body to survive. What follows is a movie full of themes about self-image and Hollywood, as well as avant-garde directing and lots of blood and body horror. The practical effects in this movie are amazing, but unfortunately, I can't show most of them without getting demonetized. I think this movie strikes the perfect balance of somehow feeling both universal and incredibly niche. The messages it's communicating are understandable and touch on something that most people can relate to, but the presentation is out there enough to make the movie extremely memorable. There's a lot of conversation surrounding this movie, but I'm struck with the feeling that even the people who like it are kind of underselling it by making it seem simpler than it is. Don't get me wrong, there is definitely a simplicity to this movie that is a good thing. It's like a modern day fable, and I think presenting itself as that sort of digestible story will lead to some staying power. It's just that, while watching the film, I found certain scenes resonating with me in a very specific way. It can be read as not just a film about body image issues and societal standards, but also about having a complicated relationship with your own body and mind in a more general way. Or at least I think that's the case. This film isn't just about body horror, it's about the horror of even having a body. But before I get too deep into that, let's try to digest the film's core themes, the ones that are making this movie part of the cultural conversation. The protagonist of the film, Elizabeth, is clearly dealing with self-esteem issues, but those issues didn't just manifest themselves out of nowhere. Her producer talks about her like a thing that needs to be discarded because of her age, and the pressures of Elizabeth's career make pretty privilege a thing of necessity in her industry. Elizabeth basically feels backed into a corner. Her old life and career are being stripped away from her for reasons she has no control over. She takes the titular substance as a perceived method of regaining control. She uses the younger body, who she names Sue, to regain her job, her status, and the social privileges that come with being perceived as attractive. Here, the substance is basically a stand-in for cosmetic surgery. The fable-esque nature of the movie starts to become clear when Sue begins to abuse the substance. She needs Elizabeth's spinal fluid to keep herself stable, and starts taking too much of it in order to spend more time in her young body. Doing this harms Elizabeth both physically and mentally. Sue's abuse of the substance kit causes Elizabeth to age rapidly, but it should be noted that even before Sue started indulging herself, Elizabeth was suffering negative psychological effects. She quickly starts to sink into a depression and isolates herself from others. By creating this other self that she sees as more deserving and worthy than she is, she actually makes her self-esteem worse, at least for the periods in which she inhabits her original body. She is alienated from herself literally by being split in two, but also mentally. There's a scene where she's on the phone with the provider of the substance, and she mentions that Sue needs to control herself, and her provider reminds her that she needs to control herself. She and Sue are the same person, but neither version of her feels that way. Elizabeth views Sue as selfish, while Sue views Elizabeth as pathetic. If this film was less fantastical, this dynamic could exist mentally, and probably does for a lot of people. Self-loathing and poor self-esteem go hand in hand. Even though Elizabeth is kind of the creator of her own demise, she is still a victim of her circumstance, which is being an older woman in Hollywood and, as a result, internalizing the male gaze. G-A-Z-E. The male gaze is an idea that Laura Mulvey wrote about in her 1975 essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. The idea is that works of art are often adopting the perspective of heterosexual men. If the man behind the camera is taking that perspective, then the camera is taking that perspective. If the camera is taking that perspective, then the audience is forced into that perspective as well. During the scenes where Sue is filming her show, there are many shots that focus on her ass to a degree that is almost comical. I think this is meant to reflect the perspective that Sue, and by extension Elizabeth, have adopted. They are viewing themselves through the male gaze, so successfully exciting the viewers of their program adds to their perceived self-worth. Or maybe these scenes are just to show that Sue is hot, I don't know for sure that this is a subversion of the male gaze in that it's supposed to show the way in which it's been internalized by this woman, but in my opinion, that's what the director was going for. The next aspect of the substance that I want to talk about is related to Sue's abuse of Elizabeth's body and Elizabeth's disapproval of it. But in order to really discuss that aspect of the film, I'm going to have to share a little bit about myself. There are reasons that certain scenes in this film resonated with me to a point where I felt like I had to make a video about it, and I feel like if I don't explain those reasons, then my arguments in this section will fall pretty flat. So, before we continue talking about the substance, here's the story of how I fucked up my face by accident, but also on purpose. Like many North American women, I take part in the grooming practice of plucking my eyebrows to keep them looking clean, I guess. A few years ago, I was going through a kind of stressful time at my day job and realized that I had been over-plucking my eyebrows to the point that they looked much thinner than I wanted them to. So, naturally, I stopped plucking them and let them grow out. Except, I didn't do that. Every time I walked past a mirror or ran my hand across my face, I would get distracted by just a hair or sometimes a few hairs that felt out of place for reasons I couldn't articulate. I didn't want to keep plucking and thinning them out, but if I ignored the hairs, then the hairs were the only thing I could think about for the next several hours. Eventually, I would give in and either pluck them out with tweezers or, if those weren't available, I would try to pull them out with my hands. Over the course of the next several weeks, this went from something I considered a bad habit that I needed to overcome and into something that was kind of ruining my life for reasons that, even now with the benefit of hindsight, are really hard to describe. I started pulling at my hair so much that calluses were forming on my fingers. I would have a hard time convincing myself that I really wanted to stop pulling my hair when my face was 2 inches away from a mirror, with tweezers digging under my skin to make sure I was getting the roots out. There was often blood on my tweezers, and I was giving myself scabs on my face, which did not deter me even a little bit. Soon I started pulling out the hairs on my head that were going gray, despite not being self-conscious about them. They just looked different, and that made them stand out, which made me want to pluck them out. Over the course of, I don't know, maybe a few weeks, I went from having thin eyebrows to no eyebrows, and despite me desperately wanting them to grow back, anytime a new hair appeared, I would pluck it out. After talking to a friend and trying to verbalize the nightmarish feeling of wanting to stop pulling out my hair, being technically able to stop pulling out my hair, but being unable to stop, I finally just called my doctor. It turns out I had a condition called trichotillomania, which is a disorder where you feel the irresistible urge to pull out your hair. It's often triggered by stress. I'm doing a lot better now, but it was an especially rough period for me, and especially a rough period for the relationship between my brain and my body. So, the substance. I'm almost positive that Coralie Farjat, who wrote and directed The Substance, was mostly focused on the themes of the film that I already talked about earlier. Beauty standards, plastic surgery, body image, etc. But I think she also tapped into something really resonant for people who suffer from compulsive self-harm. The scene where Elizabeth reacts to her overly aged finger made me think of the time I came back from a friend's place, saw myself in the mirror, and realized my entire left eyebrow was gone. The scene where Elizabeth is pleading with herself to just stop overtaking when she becomes Sue felt real and visceral. The scene where Elizabeth can't even leave her house because she can't stop obsessing over herself in the mirror was probably the most horrific part of this horror movie. Sue screaming at Elizabeth to control herself makes me feel insane. These scenes don't necessarily speak to the themes of body image issues, nor do they specifically speak to my weird experience that I described about 4 paragraphs ago. They just speak to the feeling of hating yourself, or more specifically, hating what you're doing to yourself. This is kind of what I meant when I said up top that I think this film captures the horror of just having a body. There are things about your body that you can control, things you can't control, and things that contradict your own well-being, whether that be physical or mental. Amanda the Jedi made a video about The Substance where she mentions the idea of drug addiction. I think that's also an applicable metaphor. Something you might want to stop and that you know is hurting you, but you just feel like you can't stop regardless. Things like some eating disorders or other body-focused repetitive behaviors might also fall under this umbrella. Amanda also brings up the picture of Dorian Gray, which is a classic novel in which the protagonist doesn't age or degrade despite his lifestyle, but a painting of him does. At the end of the novel, Dorian destroys what he views as the wretched painting, which then also destroys him. The scene in The Substance where Sue almost kills Elizabeth but then realizes she can't without also destroying herself was very reminiscent of that novel for me. While Sue might hate herself, she is still bound by that body. The violence Elizabeth and Sue are inflicting on themselves and each other are most obviously a metaphor for cosmetic procedures, which are a kind of self-inflicted violence. It comes with legitimate risks and can be motivated by self-loathing. In the case of Elizabeth, that is the most applicable metaphor as it is so heavily ingrained in the industry she works in. That being said, I don't want anyone to interpret this video as being like staunchly morally against anyone who's had cosmetic procedures. Bodily autonomy is a good thing. Having the option to change things about your body is a net positive. I would much rather live in a world where everyone has freedom over their body, even if that means they might make mistakes, than I would live in a world where people dictate what you can and can't do, what you can and can't look like. Full disclosure, after my whole eyebrow fiasco, I did get microblading, and I do not regret it. That's also worth interrogating, though. It was kind of expensive, and it might be a bit motivated by my self-esteem issues. I didn't like the way I looked, and I wanted to change that. It is something I had to reflect on, and I came to the conclusion that it was a decision based on my own internal lens. I mentioned earlier that Sue and Elizabeth are viewing themselves through the way that others perceive them. The male gaze, the audience, their fans, their producer, anyone but themselves. It made me think of a TEDx talk I watched a few years ago by Robert Hogue. He's had some facial deformities from birth, and when he was a teenager, he was given the opportunity to undergo additional surgeries to fix his appearance. The thing was, the surgery had a 25% chance of making him blind. While he was considering this, one of his siblings said, "What use is it being pretty if he can't even see himself?" Hogue says that's the moment where he started to own his face, thinking about it from his perspective instead of other people's. And I'm not going to pretend that I had some huge, noticeable, life-altering problem just because I had no eyebrows. I had multiple people think it was an aesthetic choice I made willingly, and hilariously, I had someone point out to me that sparse or bleached eyebrows were actually in style. And I don't even think they were lying. The thing was, while I did care a little bit about how other people were perceiving me, I also cared about how I was perceiving me. My face was reminding me of a pretty weird and stressful time, and it's not how I wanted to look. So I changed it. It would be super easy to end this video there and say, oh, we all just need to always know exactly when we're doing something for ourselves and when we're doing it for other people, and then the problem will be solved. But it's obviously a bit more complicated than that. The line between what we want and what other people want is sometimes very blurry. The Substance actually reveals the blurriness of that line, with Sue's wants being Elizabeth's wants and Elizabeth's wants being against her own best interest. There's a concept that I love in theory but struggle with in practice, and that is body neutrality. The concept is that you don't need to love your body. You don't need to find yourself attractive. You have a body the same way that you have consciousness. It's just what you are, and that's that. It's a nice idea, but it's also difficult. There is an inherent dissonance between consciousness and the body. That's what The Substance is about. That's what this video is about. The body will not always tolerate what the mind wants, and it can be agonizing. I can't confidently end this video by saying what you should or shouldn't do with your body, so I'll just offer some vague advice. Try not to see your body as the enemy. Your body is a part of you, and even if it's a part that you hate for one reason or another, it's something you are going to have to work with in whatever way you choose. The Substance is a movie about a woman who hates her body, and that hatred extends to the other parts of herself and leads to her demise, doing something she knows she shouldn't do because she's so desperate to not be herself anymore. You are you, and that's someone you'll always have to live with. Thank you for enduring this nightmare with me. If you enjoyed this video, please let the algorithm know by liking or subscribing. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.
But in the meantime, take care of yourself.